Bernard de Montreal. Book Beyond the Mind. Chapter 8. The Dual Fantasy. Through formal or informal education, we have been groomed to think in a manner that insulates our mind from in-depth thinking or conscious inner dialogue. We are predisposed to jog along the beaten track of recorded ideas, taking thought for granted as if it were a process in which we alone were concerned. We have failed to realize that the mind is a universal network of interdimensional communication between different planes, the mental, the astral and the physical world. We have been shortchanged in our ignorance about the mind that is without finality, and so advanced in its creative potential that to egocentric rationalism it is beyond intellectual grasp. We want to understand it and yet refuse to venture beyond self-centered reference points. As the basis for all possible categories of thought, the subjective mind limits us to the framework of our psychological territory because of a lack of integration of astral and mental energy intimately related to the ego's complex psychic makeup. These unintegrated forces become the boundaries of our sensorially conditioned existence. Were it not for this limitation, the mind would be free to explore the multidimensional aspects of global psychic reality from a personal as well as a pre-personal or cosmic point of view. We are short-sighted because of a subjective perception of the mind and a rational interpretation of thought. This end result of a descendant energy that begins its radiant movement in light dimensions that are the foundation of being reality, is otherwise limitless in its capacity to inform the self. We treat thoughts as our own and in so doing fail to understand the complex structure of the mind and its cosmic origin. This blind spot has predetermined the conditions which have brought about unnecessary suffering throughout history and have made evolutionary supramental consciousness impossible. We like to think of ourselves as autonomous beings, but we are absolutely interdependent, through extension in times unknown, with other intelligences whose relationship with man is woven into the very fabric of his individual and indivisible reality. We, as human beings, cannot, for want of awareness, understand that our reality supports another, which in turn supports ours to an extent so far-reaching. The unconscious mind would crack were it given an instant of gratuitous insight into its universal network. We live a double existence and are totally unaware of it. We have always considered death a no man's land when it is intimately linked to our everyday existence and decision-making. Unaware of the close presence of more or less evolved entities in the death or astral world acting as our guides and often uninvited guests, we are unable to communicate or establish a dialogue with the guiding principle of our consciousness, which is our thought adjuster, or higher self. Our mind rarely expands beyond an unconscious astral level, which exerts an undue influence on it as the most important force in personality development. This submental condition is accountable for our lack of conscious awareness of the higher self. We have no mind of our own, ruled as we are by non-creative, egocentric thoughts kept alive by entities that live on our vital forces. We have become slaves to thought masters and ideologies whose powerful influences have created the false magnetic centers that weave their impressions into our fictitious personalities. We have lost the universal capacity to instruct ourselves as we live under one form of influence or another. It is no wonder that we stray so far away from ourselves and experience so little of the whole mind. We think we are intelligent because of the status of our sciences, when in fact they represent a straightforward infusion of astral consciousness into ours through forces or entities that pursue their goals in a parallel world, not always corresponding to the good of our own. Their world is called the death plane. It should be renamed the astral plane, if only to destroy the illusion of finality in its meaning. When we speak of death as the end of life, we are playing into the hands of the astral world. We lower a veil over our consciousness which prevents us from dealing with the death phenomena in a conscious manner. Present-day psychology, which does not understand death beyond its morbid appearances or mythical symbolism, is a Promethean science bound by the chains of its own unconsciousness. Its genius is weakened by intellectual evaluations that kill the science of the mind, since it is studied from a purely psychological point of view. The mind is psychic in origin and becomes psychological at its subjective level. Classical psychology will not deal with death in a direct manner through the extraordinary tool of thought contact, as it has not yet grasped the objective nature of its reality. Anyone can communicate with the death world. Anyone with an open mind can discern the lies which pour forth from this Odella as it seeks to maintain the illusions of the mind that spring from subjective thought. The universe is not as clean-cut and physical as we would like it to be. The astral forces of involution and their accommodating lies are total in dominating the psychic and consequently the psychological life of man. The mind is a psychic territory that extends into the supermental levels of consciousness. It can be explored freely, providing fundamental changes of the self have secured a fuller understanding of its inner mechanisms. The mind hovers imperially over convention and its duality. It propels itself far beyond such polarity as it moves through the network of supermental intelligence. Unconsciousness is a fantasy in its perception of such a minute portion of mind reality. The fantasy lies in an inability to discern between the subjective astral and objective mental dimensions of the self, debilitating the self in its maneuver beyond the subjective field of consciousness. The personality becomes its terminal, leaving real identity in the unknown. Consciousness remains an uncharted frontier rather than a wide-open psychic field through which we may move at will in our quest for a global understanding of life, death and beyond. The universe of the mind is akin to the psychic structures of intelligent life. Our understanding of it is either mystical or materialistic, creating conditions that thwart the necessary objective understanding of its occult dimensions. When approached mystically or spiritually, it remains unfathomable and subject to the vagaries of a void which leads to unintelligent, naive, blind faith. In fact, the void is but the totality of misunderstood psychic dimensions of the mind, unexplorable by a mystical or materialistic ego. There is no such thing as the void in an absolute sense. The universe is inhabited on different planes by intelligences of different evolutionary status. All dimensions evolve absolutely and in absolute relative terms. In the creative objective process of the mind, man can move through the void of his consciousness along its psychic lines of force to discover its mechanisms and principles. As such, void no longer indicates emptiness, but freedom from psychic and psychological debris. When the fantasy of the mind has been identified, self-instruction begins and the ego ceases to be the pawn in a cosmic astral game. Inner communication is the key to understanding the mechanics of consciousness, and cannot be experienced before the mind has fully opened up to a mental plane free of astral coloring. Inner communication is to the mind what subjective thought is to the unconscious ego, the difference being akin to that between knowing and not knowing. Subjective knowledge has its roots in the reflective thinking process. This portion of mind activity is the tip of the iceberg of its overall creative reach. Beyond the reflective stage stretches the vast reality of universal circuits, which can be tapped by the mind in its ascendant evolutionary development towards the objective sagacity of the self. The psychic universe is an integral part of consciousness. The ignorance of this fact contradicts the very foundation of human reality, and the natural talent to deal with life in a fashion that corresponds to its ultimate meaning dwindles. We are not on earth to simply exist but to acquire a universal science of reality and apply it. This is what evolution is all about. Growth must extend beyond sense-conditioned intelligence and lead to an integral understanding of the mechanics of the mind. The latter is of an order that reaches far beyond the basic intellectual workings of consciousness. Within physical man, there is an astral and etheric consciousness through which the psychic world shares human reality. Until the inner function of thought communication is fully understood by evolving awareness, contact with the universal circuits of the mind will remain a mystery, and experience will be pursued as befits all astral beings cut out for an eventual return to the death plane. The notion that the universe is perfect beyond its physical model is wishful thinking. In all of its composite and multidimensional aspects, it remains an evolutionary process in which cosmic forces provide the necessary conditions for the development of a unified relationship between the higher and lower self on the lower planes of human reality. Man takes part in the evolution and integration of these lower principles towards a potential thought contact with interdimensional intelligence. The basic problem faced by the ego with respect to such a life venture lies in the strong influence experienced at the astral level. Unaware of this existential condition, the ego is preyed upon by forces that feed on its denser mentality. The difficulty is compounded by the lack of integration of the physical, astral and mental reality. Once the self has overcome the body-mind illusion, the astral forces at work within become self-evident. Then the chain of illusions that prevent physical, astral, and the higher mental union can be broken to free the self from the rational and emotional subjective personality and the astral influences in a mind that has not yet achieved full maturity. Consciousness pulses with subliminal energy currents that distract the ego from objective thought contact with the higher mental plane. This conditions lower mental or intellectual life to thought pollution and prevents the self from recognizing its mind source. Consciousness is here divided and mental experience of a lower order is imposed upon it. Such pollution cripples the formative and post-formative years of egoic development. It plunges the individual helplessly into a series of experiences and struggles, a measure of the lack of integrated reality and the source of unnecessary suffering. This scourge of existence makes man's life one of constant strife instead of what it should be, one of continuous construction without pain. The dual nature of his consciousness creates the blind spot which must be seen through in order for him to increase his power over the karma of life he has come to call experience. Consciousness cannot in its evolutionary scheme escape the fact of alternate realities intermingling with the physical experience. Until this fact is dealt with, the ego will continue to seek the meaning of existence through philosophy, religion, or material science rather than through a process that coincides with the individualized and integrated power of its whole consciousness. Its double nature must be grasped so man may be free from astral thoughts. The fantasy that clouds discernment and negates the bond between the physical, astral, and mental worlds. Without the will to realize this, free will remains for the ego a limited involutionary condition. The universe is a vast reservoir of intelligence in movement at specific levels of interaction with man, and invisible to him, is more concrete than the physical world it ordains. The conscious ego has the innate ability to live its life in conjunction with the higher mental development once it has set itself free from subjective and opinionated thinking habits. The mind, regardless of its state of consciousness, experiences in varying degrees either the astral or the mental planes, that are intelligence dimensions in their own right. The mind is coterminal with intelligence circuits that are as much a part of man as he is of them. The foundation of intelligence extends beyond the physical world. The universe lies beyond human imagination, and the understanding of life will remain a mystery until it is studied through the higher channels of the mind. An impossible task for the intellect because it has an astral quality of thought. The full measure of the life study can only be communicated through the mental plane or investigated through the use of a body woven of subtle etheric energy. The fundamental categories of the intellect camouflage their corresponding astral veils of the soul. Beyond these veils is situated the etheric energy of the higher self, or double, or thought adjuster as it is also referred to. This is the cosmic principle of light and intelligence, and the only seat of objective knowledge and freedom, and the ultimate goal of all sentient evolution. Religions, science, or philosophy cannot grapple objectively with questions of reality because of the astral limitations of unconscious thought. Not until the mind has grown beyond its lower function will man gain total access to the vastness of life and be able to explain the mysteries in a fashion that will bring the science of the spheres to his consciousness. The dual fantasy is not simply a lower condition of life but more exactly a lower condition of thought. The reality of the mind is a galactic phenomenon in which billions upon billions of beings are involved in coordinating thought with action at all levels of the cosmic process. When man experiences the astral illusion of free will, he is temporarily relieved and protected from a disturbing realization through the mechanism of an illusory freedom. This mechanism allows him to live his earth experience without being conscious of the presence of forces active within him at the soul and spirit level which fight for a position of strength within his experience. The soul is controlled by involutionary forces, whereas the spirit, double, or higher self is an evolutionary force that seeks in time to bring man back to his source by way of thought communication with him. The higher self is a being whose role or activity in the mental worlds is the perfecting of the soul experience. Since the soul incarnates in a total blackout of its astral memory. Through this lengthy process, man lives, dies, and is reborn until such time as the soul no longer needs to return to the physical experience. At this stage of its evolution, it is sufficiently evolved to fuse with the spirit force of its higher self or double, finally breaking the reincarnational cycle that is its link and contract with death and the astral world. Here begins real freedom from planetary and astrally dominated experience. There are legions of beings on lower planes of evolution who, in disincarnate or astral form, intercede in the evolution of man according to his spiritual needs. Regardless of his lower or higher astral relationship with them. The self must eventually be rid of them so that fusion with his own spirit force may be established in order to integrate the mental, astral, and physical dimensions of self-reality. Astral beings, or disincarnated souls, are limited to the same conditions of knowledge as man, except for their access to his planetary records, which they can use wisely or unwisely depending on the stage of their evolution. Since man is insufficiently conscious of the astral laws that underlie and condition the activities of the death world, he is easy prey to their influence, which can either spiritualize or animalize his mind depending on the karmic link between the incarnated soul and the astral influence. As long as the ego relies on the help of astral beings, his life perpetuates the karmic link with astral life forms. They in turn channel him their own limited consciousness and experience, and in many cases, outright lies that the naive ego cannot discern. Lying is a law in the death world to an extent that would shock the unprepared and unsuspecting mind. It is a way for astral beings to maintain their power over man. This gigantic cosmic game is part of the evolution of consciousness. So refined is the mind game, so advanced its science, so occult its laws, that generations of unwise men succumb to them without the least insight or will to oppose them. It is the very stuff of which life is made on earth. It could be compared to the subtle mind games men play in the arena of world diplomacy. In actual fact, these strategies emanate from the astral plane of human unconsciousness. Man is a complete stranger in his own house. Unaware of the mind games played on him by astral beings, he lives on the sidelines of his reality and composes with inner thoughts that are more often than not of astral rather than mental origin. His fight or inner knowledge is so distant from his consciousness Most of his life is spent searching for meaning that cannot be found. The dual fantasy of his unconscious existence moves him through experiences which he must undergo for lack of a creative intelligence that can only be had through conscious contact with his real self. He searches through religion, philosophy, and science, and soon discovers that reality is unattainable through those involutionary paths. He dies as ignorant as he was born. More experience has been gathered by the soul. The ego remains the dupe, and the soul the beneficiary, while life is a path that only leads to death. Intellectual pride and spiritual naivety are man's worst enemies. Through pride, he fails to understand the mechanics of thought and its origins, thinking that he is in charge of his destiny. Through religious dogmatism or spiritual naivety, he mystifies heaven and hell and adheres to a traditional concept of divinity that isolates him from the psychic and multidimensional universe reality of its governing bodies. His emotions are used to weave within him a blanket of arrogance or fear that cushions his intelligence experience but never makes it whole. His consciousness lacks continuity and forces him to seek happiness under any form possible in order to forget his ignorance of cosmic law and order. Should he look beyond the gates of the physical world and the astro-mystical ignorance in the concept of heaven and hell, he would understand that the reality underlying his experience is greater than fiction, a science so exact as to render involutionary philosophy, science, and religion a short path that misses a vastly more liberating, organizational, intelligent future. Unconscious man is unable to penetrate the deep layers of his mind in a cognizant state of inquiry. Consequently, he cannot fathom the mystery of the soul. He does not realize that its original makeup is one of pure energy that degenerates through the process of incarnation until the reversal of this involutionary cycle takes place in an age when the mental body is sufficiently developed for him to pass to another level of evolution. Not until freedom from dominant ideologies has been achieved will full consciousness be possible and thought contact with the mental planes a conscious experience. As a result of this change in the evolutionary dynamics of the mind, the soul or astral forces will recede and the spirit forces of consciousness will imprint themselves upon the new mind, freeing man from the slavery of ignorance and allowing him to gain control over the astral forces on earth. His mental nature will grow until the ability to work at will with the elemental forces is restored. Elemental forces are astral in origin but do not partake of the activities of the death world. They are not of the dead. Their fidelity to the forces of light have made them unapproachable. Never were they at the mercy of the forces that control the astral plane. Man must one day regain control of them and work with them in order to add to the life experience a new dimension above and beyond the possibilities of his material sciences. Elementals are the only forces devoid of intention in the astral world. This makes them perfect servants. Contrary to entities who achieve astral evolution through their manipulative and subliminal contact with man, elementals are at his service, but man cannot benefit from their presence and activities beyond the plane of his spiritual imagination. For this reason, he has since time immemorial craved for magic, or the suspension of the physical laws. This craving is part of a time-lost contact with elemental forces. Astral entities of the death world, however, have the ability to use man's desire for magic against him in the black or white arts. Unconscious as he is, he has little reference that would allow him to see through the subtle game being played against him for reasons that are deemed good by him, regardless of the leanings of his personality towards good or bad. The end of the 20th century is witness to a mass return to the craving for magic through advanced cinematographic techniques in general and occult sciences in particular. The interest in paranormal activities and psychic sciences has gained momentum in the most advanced nations on Earth to a point that contradicts their scientific doctrines and achievements. The psychic and the scientific, traditionally opposed, are slowly coming together in their own way, each under its own conditions. Much remains to be clarified in the domain of occult sciences before they can be assumed safe for the seeker of paranormal dimensions of reality. New guidelines must be established in order to protect the naive seeker of truth. Even today the majority of occult sciences are still dangerous for the human mind, for they have not been deastralized or decoded from their ancient meanings.